Welcome to a special episode of the Proforest Podforest. In this episode, Dr. Jiri Hulcr from the University of Florida School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences will take us on an auditory journey to Indonesia, the most biodiverse country on the planet. Indonesia is also an economic and geopolitical powerhouse with immense implications for biosecurity. We are very excited to have Dr. Jiri Hulcr on the podcast again. Jiri, thank you for joining us.
I am very happy to be back.
And yes, that's a good point. Some of our listeners might recall Jiri being one of our first guests last year. And, Jiri, I think some people are probably wondering, what exactly does a forest entomologist actually do for a living? Because I think some people might think you just sit around and identify bugs and all that kind of stuff. But there's a bit more to it. You've been all over the place. You've been international doing some incredible things. So please enlighten us on what you actually do for a living.
What does a forest entomologist does for a living? I sit in a lab and count bugs, right? No. Counting bugs is a small part of it. We are obviously a team focused on insects, but the real reason for our existence is that we're really pushing the boundaries of what humanity knows about forest insects and their relationships with trees, with forests, with people, with the rest of the planet. And we are also trying to reimagine the relationship between people and the rest of the life around us, including these insects. So it goes both ways. And a big part of that is, of course, understanding the big picture, the planetary scale picture. No country is isolated now. No forest is isolated now. And that's why we travel quite a lot.
So you've given us a few different audio files that we'll be listening to throughout this episode of just some of your observations and commentaries that we're very excited to share with our listeners.
I hope you enjoy them.
All right. Well, I suppose we should just get right into it then.
I'm sitting in a rainforest in Java, Indonesia, 1,200 meters above the sea level. It's about 6 o'clock, so the sun has set and the night life is coming out. This is a mountain that, unlike almost the entire rest of the island, has been spared of deforestation. There is a nice forest. In fact, for some reason, this looks like a primary forest. It looks like it has never been logged. It's sitting at the basis of a volcano, active volcano. At this time of the day or night, the magical creatures are coming out. I just saw Ornithoptera, the bird-winged butterfly, flying by, giant colorful things that don't live anywhere else than in Southeast Asia. And the bats are coming out. I'm here trapping for bark beetles, and this is the first time in approximately 100 years that an active, intentional, and legal research on bark beetles in collaboration with Indonesian scientists is happening. The last time systematists worked on Java was in the 1930s, before the Dutch Empire collapsed and they all withdrew. And now we are again able to make bilateral agreements under the Nagoya Protocol that benefit both sides. And so we're doing it. Java has some of the most incredible bark beetles. It's a prime example of the fact that what most of the forest entomology literature considers pests is actually turning out to be endangered species. We don't know how many species live here. It's definitely more than 200 or 300. And the great majority of them have been seen once. And they're sitting in European museums as singletons or just a couple of specimens. And have not been seen for 100 years until now. And with my colleagues at the University of Brawijaya, we are hoping to restart a legitimate, productive, and mutually beneficial and respectful research on forest entomology. And we need each other. Turns out, Indonesia is the third biggest country and soon to be the fourth biggest economy in the world. Geopolitically, strategically really important between the US, China, and other big powers. Indonesia is going to be important, and it's eating up its resources. Most of its forests are gone by now, replaced by monocultures of planted trees, or mostly actually agriculture. The remaining forests are what really could be a religious experience for most people these days. Wilderness, noisy, with not just biodiversity but also bioabundance. We in the technological West really need that. And at the same time, folks here really need us in terms of helping with the management of the natural resources. We mostly squandered ours. Let's make sure that these remain.
So Jiri, can you kind of fill us in on exactly what all we were listening to? What was that very consistent sort of rattling sound, for lack of a better word?
We've heard the sound of the forest. The dominant sound was cicadas. There were also birds in the background that you could have heard that come out in the evening. Biodiversity is incredible, and I just wanted to also emphasize the word bioabundance, which is something that we don't really have in the US all that much anymore. Imagine what the world looked like when the first Europeans came to the US, right? To North America, right? Imagine the flocks of cranes and pigeons and grasshoppers and the herds of buffaloes and so on. We have no records of what the insect life was like back then. We can only imagine. And we know very well now that over just the last half a century, the insect biomass around the world dropped by disturbing half. Somewhere it was 90%, somewhere it was less than that. But the abundance of living things is going away scary fast. In our short lifetimes, we've seen a massive drop in this, what I call the bioabundance around the world, including here in Indonesia. And that's why these little pockets of beautiful rainforest are, I would call them again a religious experience.
So you mentioned this was the first legal study that was done in collaboration with the Indonesian scientists. So can you kind of give us a little bit of background on how this was able to happen and the significance of Java, Indonesia in particular?
By illegal, I don't mean that other collaborations are illegal. By illegal, I mean that we are really following the international agreements on benefit sharing under the Nagoya Protocol, to which the U.S. is not a signatory, but Indonesia is, and most other countries are. And essentially, the Nagoya Protocol intends to protect not necessarily the insects or the biodiversity, but to protect the local people, the local scientists, local communities in biodiverse places against what is often called a helicopter science or helicopter sampling, where Western companies or Western scientists descend upon some incredible patch of nature, explore or take away the resources, often genetic resources, and leave very little for the local communities, whether those are scientists or students, the local academia, or the local communities, or the local companies. We in the technologically developed West can gain much more profit from such activities, and the Nagoya Protocol is trying to make sure that benefits stay where they originated. And so we're doing it with bark beetles. What we're doing here is that we're partnering with a local university, with their forest entomologists and with their students and with the local research agencies, and making sure that Since we do have the funding to do these studies that ultimately protect American forests and forestry and American ecosystems against invasive species, that while we're doing it here, we're also sharing benefits with the local folks, the local collaborators. We are teaching, we are providing workshops and student opportunities and so on to make sure that this collaboration remains mutually beneficial. Because you know what? The biggest scar on the soul of Indonesia and many places like that are still the colonial times that really kind of defines the national identity. And it's really important to move away from that.
So you'd mentioned the forests getting replaced with monoculture.
Yeah, people are planting a lot of eucalyptus, a lot of acacia, which some of them are native trees, some of them are not. Traditionally, the biggest export in terms of forestry from Indonesia was teak.
Teak.
Beautiful wood and fast-growing and easy to work with for furniture and all kinds of different things. That led to a lot of soil erosion, unfortunately. The teak plantations are not trivial, and it has often been replaced with fast-growing acacia or eucalyptus and other fast-growing things, which are used mostly for pulp. And increasingly, the land is used for two dominant uses now, which is, well, three really. Agriculture, of course, for food, but also oil palm is now the biggest driver of deforestation or really land conversion, because there really isn't actually that much forest left in Java. But in other parts of Indonesia, which remain much more forested, oil palm is the main driver. And by oil palm, I really mean the soap in your bathroom and the oil in your peanut butter. That is driving deforestation. And the third one is clearing land for human development, for urban development, just like in Florida.
So these forests that have been converted, what was the sort of ownership of these forests beforehand? Was it privately owned? Were these sort of national lands?
That's a fascinating question. And just like in any other part of the world, it depends on how far in time you go, right? Actually, Java is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. Some of the early kingdoms emerged thousands of years ago and really developed their own civilization, their own writing, their own art, their own systems of commerce and agriculture. And it was a feudal system, of course. And it has been a mixture of a feudal system where land was owned by whoever conquered it, but also traditional community-owned forests where there was no higher sort of legal system or royal ownership. More recently, during colonial times, guess who owned it, right? It was the colonial powers. In the case of Indonesia, it was the Dutch government. And after that, after independence, legal ownership of the forest went to the Indonesian government. The Indonesian government then passes down the ownership and the management, not ownership, but management of the forests down to regional and local governments, and those pass it down to even smaller communities, citizen organizations. Now, you can imagine how this multi-layered system leads to constant squabbles, constant power struggles, and the fact that it's a fairly murky system led to the fact that it is hard to regulate, and it also was a major contributor to the ongoing deforestation.
So a pretty stark difference than private ownership here in the South, South U.S.
It's exactly the opposite extreme. Understanding how ownership of forests works in other places gives us a really nice mirror for our own society. It gives us the understanding that we're also one end of an extreme. The way land is owned in the Southeast U.S. is very unusual compared to any other place in the world, where most places typically have a mixture of some government ownership, government oversight at least, or a regulation of how forests and agricultural land can be used. In the Southeast U.S., the complete privatization of land is really interestingly not usually anywhere else in the world. And interestingly, both the complete government takeover and the complete privatization led to similar rates of deforestation. Now, in times when population is reaching limits of the carrying capacity of the land, we're seeing that places like Indonesia and Brazil are obviously deforesting their rainforest fast, but the fastest rate of land conversion from forest to other uses is actually in Florida.
So I mentioned before, living in Florida my whole life, and I'm almost 29. Not that long, objectively, I suppose. It is disturbing to see continued development and perhaps in some cases reckless development, and it's getting harder to find these sort of serene spots where I can kind of tune all the other noises out, completely separated from society, so to speak. Let's listen to this other clip that you've given us about some of the serenity in the forest here in Indonesia.
You can hear the silence of the woods. You can almost hear the flapping of the bat wings around me. There's so many bats, it's amazing. You can hear the night birds, but you can also hear the thundering of the motorcycle behind me on the other side of the valley. This here is total magic, and across the valley is reality. We are really close to losing these few remaining patches.
So I really like the sort of stark differences here. You've got this serenity in this audio, this quietness, this stillness, this religious experience, like you mentioned, Jiri. And when we talk with landowners here in the States and talk about forests broadly speaking, there are folks that have really strong, deep connections to their land, to the woods, so to speak. Maybe that's the national parks out west. Maybe it's private property here in the south. What's that sort of connection or relationship like in Indonesia?
It depends on who you are in Indonesia, and it is very different from Florida. There are as many different relationships to the forest as there are people, of course, just like anywhere in the world. The Indonesian society is very diverse. But if we speak about an average, the average is quite different from that of the US, where people tend to treasure the remaining wilderness that we have. In Indonesia, the memory of the nation is a little bit different. And that goes for actually many places in Southeast Asia. While some people absolutely treasure the biodiversity and the forestry heritage that they have, quite a lot of people don't have that strong value, don't put that strong value on them. And in fact, you could hear opinions that some people cannot wait to get rid of those forests. Why is that? The reason is their historical memory, which is that up until fairly recently, a big part of the society has lived fairly impoverished lives. Fairly recent ancestors of many people in Indonesia lived in rural situations, and so they don't necessarily consider the forest as a comfortable homeland, but more like a mark of poverty. And a lot of people feel that development towards the more Western values or Western-looking development is a good thing. And that's another reason why conservation is hard to accomplish in communities where rainforests aren't valued for any intrinsic value, where they're really seen as a resource and not much beyond resource.
This thought of the forest being this sort of old memory, so to speak, and this sort of push towards development, it's a complicated, to put it lightly, sort of environment to navigate. And on that note, we have this other awesome clip kind of showing that dichotomy of you at an airport discussing this sort of growth, so to speak, in Indonesia. Let's take a listen to this observation.
I am back in Surabaya now. Surabaya is a coastal town of a couple of million people with no forests except for a couple of teak plantations, but with an international airport. And that's why I'm here. I'm heading home, back to the United States. I'm standing in front of a rice field here. You can hear some of the birdies chirping. Those are the pretty canaries that in the US would be considered a nice pets for their nice song and color. Here they're considered rice pests. You can hear some occasional barking gecko. There are also a lot of bats here in the day, which surprises me. And behind the rice field is this giant bustling city of Surabaya, an epitome of Indonesia's growth, replacing the landscape with cities, replacing natural resources with development. You know, on this trip I've learned a couple of things. One of them is that Indonesia is big, rich, and complicated. But it's also a very interestingly functional democracy. And it's moving forward fast. One thing that is clear from this part of the world is that the nations around the world are not going to wait for the United States to resolve its internal squabbles. The big nations that are involved in the balances of power in the world are just moving on forward. Indonesia is the third most populous country, and it's about to be the fourth biggest economy. I don't think we could afford to ignore this part of the world.
I'm often asked, how does this relate to a forest landowner in Florida or Alabama or anywhere? It's very easy. One of the biggest emerging issues for forestry, speaking of forestry, but it's really for agriculture, for any type of natural resources, is exotic invasive pests and pathogens. It is the diseases that are plaguing our agriculture. It's the bugs and fungi that are killing our trees, against which we have no defenses. Our trees have no defenses against them. And if we ignore these organisms in their original countries, we are blindfolding ourselves for the moment when they arrive. Because you know what? Trade continues unabated. Trade continues to increase. And with trade continues the influx of exotic organisms. So I'm here to explore the future threats to our American forests.
So my natural follow-up is to talk about these sorts of lessons and wisdom that could be shared from Indonesia here into the United States. But I know you have some observations of that from your trip. So let's take a listen.
There are many topics on which we can engage with Indonesia on. Of course, one of them is biosecurity. We already talked about some of the bark beetles and ambrosia beetles that are potential threats to our own forests and trees in the United States. Many of them already are. As I'm standing here next to the rice field, I see these giant aquatic snails laying their eggs. That's already an invasive species in Florida, clogging our aquatic ecosystems. But it goes the other way around too. Biosecurity does not know borders, obviously. I see an American ambrosia beetle in every single tree called Pterocarpus here in the streets. In fact, that's what my colleagues here are studying. Euplatypus parallelus. Euplatypus parallelus is an invasive American ambrosia beetle that seems to be the finishing factor in many tree diseases. Here in Pterocarpus, an important urban tree in Indonesia, many of them are half dead or completely dead, and they're just exuding frass from this beetle. And that's an American beetle. But that's biosecurity, our own biosecurity, that we need to engage on with Indonesia. But at the same time, we can really contribute a lot to this place. There's so much that we could contribute in terms of sustainable forestry, urban forestry. Some of even the basic tenets of plant pathology, tree pathology, entomology are kind of missing here, and we can really help a lot with teaching here. Teaching in general, education, infrastructure, all that is what we can really help with. So balance of power does not need to look like another Cold War. It could actually look like genuine, helpful international collaboration and collaboration on natural resources. Right now, the bustling Indonesia looks like it's merely engaged in the race to the bottom. Barely any natural forests left. A lot of soil erosion has been going on for decades. That's another thing where we can help. I learned 3 important words here, and that's what I will leave you with. The first one is Pancasila. It essentially means 5 tenets, 5 main tenets of Indonesian unity and sovereignty and identity. The first one is belief in God, but interestingly, even though this is predominantly a Muslim nation, by constitution you can believe in whatever God you wish. The other 4 tenets are issues such as social justice, Indonesian nationalism. They really, really want to stay together despite being so diverse and scattered across nations and states and ethnic groups. And there are other tenets. We'll get to those some other time. The other word, interesting word that I learned here is lestari. Lestari means sustainable. And why it's interesting is that it actually does not seem to have that cheesy sort of academic meaning here as it often does in the US. Young kids say the word when they're taking a photo, taking a selfie, they make this L sign with their fingers of their right hand. That means lestari. And you know how in the US that means loser? Here it actually means sustainability, and students at college embrace that as their own modern value. And there's one other important word that I learned, which is Nusantara, which is not only the name of their new capital that's just being built in Kalimantan on the island of Borneo. They're literally moving a capital. Nusantara actually refers to the old ancient kingdom, really an empire that used to be centered in Java and that stretched all across those islands and all the way near India. Nusantara. And the reason why that's important is that that looms large in the psyche of most Indonesians. And that ended with colonization. That is important for people like me, for entomologists, for biologists, for people who want to work together with Indonesia. We cannot do what's called the helicopter science. Helicopter science means that a Western scientist descends upon a biodiverse land, does his or her own research, takes samples back to their own university, and does not really include the local folks. The reason why we shouldn't do that really are not the bugs or the plants. Sorry to break it to you, entomologists, but nobody really cares about the bugs. It's because it's a symbol of past colonialism, and it's an offensive attitude. And that's why when an entomologist or two, a couple of years ago, maybe decades ago, described some species without a co-authorship of the Indonesian partner, it went all over the news here. Everyone knows it. Deans of schools know this story. Again, it's not about the insect. Nobody cares. It's a return to a national tragedy, to a past trauma that they really are eager to get beyond. And that's why we need to get engaged.
So I'm curious if we could talk a little bit more about Lestari, because you had mentioned it's in the youth. We see that here in the States, a lot of people talk, like you mentioned, about sustainability and all that kind of stuff. But the youth seem to adopt it into their core values. Is that correct?
At least in Indonesia, it is a hip word. It's cool to be sustainable. I don't know how much that translates to the actions of these people as voters or as business people, yet to be seen. But I was really refreshed by seeing that as a concept that university students didn't feel like it was for the old forest. It was actually a concept for them.
What might be some lessons and wisdom that we can take, I shouldn't say we should take, that we can learn from Indonesia with respect to our forests?
What are the lessons that we can learn? The whole world should learn a lesson from what happened to a place like Java, for example, which we already mentioned has an incredible history, really rich cultural history, agricultural history. It's one of the most fertile lands on the planet with fantastic soil, a mixture of ash from the volcanoes and tropical rains. And they overshot their resources. And it's one of the stories where in a couple of centuries, most of the forests were cleared. And in just the last 1 century, most of the remaining animals and forests were cleared. And the entire island now is essentially full of people. As a society, whether it's in Florida or anywhere else, really should look at ourselves as a society interconnected by land and by all mutual needs, rather than essentially racing to who was going to be at the top and leaving the rest at the bottom. It does not work long term. The world is obviously connected. If you want your coffee or your chocolate or your rice, many of them are made or grown or mined in Indonesia and many other places. You know, we're all connected and we're all dependent on conservative use of land, no matter where it is.
So struggling with infinite growth in a finite system.
That's correct.
So to sort of, I guess, start wrapping this up, we had sort of briefly talked about earlier on some of the main research priorities, but what are some of these top areas of research that the United States and Indonesia are working on together?
Well, that would deserve its own analysis. There are many. If you ask me what we should work together, I would say at this point, any type of research, any type of development, any type of collaboration, Indonesian society and natural resources are incredibly diverse, just like they are in the United States. And the conversations have been not reflecting that. And the binational conversation has not reflected that yet. Sadly, you know what happens to the USAID agency, United States Agency for International Development, which has been behind an incredibly rich portfolio of collaborations, whether science or education or mutual trade agreements, capacities for self-governance in places like Indonesia. All those have immediate consequences for us in the United States, whether it is about the resources that we can or cannot have from the rest of the world, or whether it is about the balance of power in the rest of the world. We just have to continue the international conversation with partners like Indonesia.
Well, thank you, Jiri. I think that's a great point to end on, and thank you for providing all these observations and, of course, commentary and sharing with us and the listeners about your experience in Indonesia.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on, and I'm looking forward to the next episode.
Yeah, thank you, Jiri, for plugging. Yes, everybody, be on the lookout for future episodes of the Proforest Podforest. Take care, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the Proforest website. That's proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things Proforest, check out our social media at ProforestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ganghars Davies. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.